The Black Plague ghost ships, 14th century Europe. Imagine a ship drifting silently toward the shore, its sails torn, its deck abandoned, its crew frozen in death. No one speaks, no one steers, yet it moves, carried by a wind that feels colder than the sea itself. This was not a sailor's tale, nor a legend whispered by frightened fishermen. This was Europe in the 14th century, when ghost ships appeared on the horizon, carrying with them a horror the world had never known. Tonight, we sail into the chilling story of the Black Plague's ghost ships, where history and nightmare became one. Chapter 1. The Arrival of Death at Sea. The year was 1347. Europe, still bustling with merchants, pilgrims, and crusaders, had no idea that a shadow was already moving across the seas, a shadow that would soon choke the life out of entire kingdoms. The Black Death, as it would later be called, did not simply creep overland from the east. It sailed silently aboard ships that cut through the Mediterranean waters, carrying not only spices and silks, but also death itself. Among the most terrifying accounts to survive from that era were the stories of ghost ships, vessels that drifted into harbors without a single living soul, their sails torn, their timbers creaking, and their decks littered with corpses. Chroniclers from Genoa, Venice, Messina, and even distant Marseille all spoke of them. Some of these accounts were tinged with rumor, some with fear, but they all shared one horrifying truth. The ships were real, and they brought with them the plague. In October of 1347, the Sicilian port of Messina became one of the first European cities to witness this nightmare. According to contemporary records, a fleet of 12 galleys arrived from the Crimean port of Kaffa, their hulls heavy with cargo. At first, the harbor masters and merchants waited eagerly. Trade from the Black Sea was vital, and the city thrived on its connection to eastern markets. But as the galleys drew near, something was horribly wrong. Witnesses described the scene. Men slumped over the rails, unmoving, bodies sprawled across the decks, black swellings visible on their skin even from a distance. The few who still breathed coughed violently, their faces pale, their eyes sunken with fever. The stench, they said, hit the dock long before the ships made anchor, the acrid odor of sickness and rot carried by the wind. The authorities of Messina ordered the fleet away, refusing them entry. But it was too late. The sailors who had managed to stagger ashore spread the contagion into the city within days. Panic erupted. Families locked themselves inside their homes. Priests rang the bells in warning, and rumors spread faster than the disease itself. Some swore the ships had not been crewed by men at all, but by the hand of Satan, sent to punish Christendom. Others whispered that these were necroploi, ships of the dead, as Greek chroniclers would later call them. And yet, Messina was only the beginning. The plague ships sailed onward, unwanted but unstoppable. Ports across the Mediterranean soon closed their gates in fear, but the sea is a merciless highway. Ships cannot always be turned away, and not every vessel had living sailors to answer when called. Some floated for weeks, guided only by the wind and current, carrying their grim cargo of corpses until they finally bumped against some harbor wall, where curious locals would climb aboard and unleash death again. What terrified people most was not only the disease, but the silence of these vessels. In a time when every harbor was alive with noise, sailors shouting, ropes creaking, merchants haggling, the ghost ships arrived without a word, their decks creaking under the weight of still bodies, their sails hanging like shrouds. Chroniclers described villagers and port officials crossing themselves as they watched from shore, unwilling to board yet unable to look away. For medieval Europe, it was as if the sea itself had become a graveyard, sending forth reminders that no wall, no city, and no kingdom could truly keep the plague at bay. These ghost ships were omens, harbingers of what was to come, the death of millions, the unraveling of societies, and the beginning of Europe's darkest chapter. And so the story of the Black Plague ghost ships begins, with sails unfurled, drifting silently into ports, carrying nothing but shadows and silence, and a plague that would soon devour the world. Chapter 2: The Siege of Kaffa and the Birth of the Plague Fleet. To understand the origin of the ghost ships, we must return to the year 1346, a year before Messina saw its nightmare. Far from Sicily, on the edge of the Black Sea, lay the bustling Genoese trade colony of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia in Crimea. This outpost was a vital hub for merchants seeking the riches of the East: silks, spices, precious stones, and exotic goods that passed through the Silk Road. For decades, the Genoese had prospered here, protected by thick walls and the wealth of commerce. But in 1346, Kaffa became the stage for one of history's strangest and most horrifying sieges. The attackers were the Mongol Tatar armies of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Yani Beg. He had long resented the Genoese for their influence in the region, and now his armies surrounded the city, determined to drive the foreign merchants out. The siege was brutal, lasting months, with both sides suffering casualties. Yet it was not sword or arrow that would break the defenders. It was something far worse. In the Mongol camps, a sickness had begun to spread. Men who seemed healthy one day collapsed the next, their bodies covered in black swellings, their breath shallow, their skin darkening with strange blotches. Entire units fell within days, their corpses piling up faster than they could be buried. Chroniclers like Gabriele de Mussi, an Italian notary, would later write of what came next, an act that still horrifies historians. Desperate and enraged, the Mongols turned their misfortune into a weapon. Using massive catapults, they hurled the infected corpses of their own men over the city walls of Kaffa. Day after day, the rotting, disease-ridden bodies crashed into the streets and markets of the besieged town, spreading pestilence and terror. The Genoese, trapped within their walls, could not escape the stench or the infection. Some buried the bodies quickly, others burned them. But the contagion was already in the air, in the water, and in their veins. What happened in Kaffa would later be seen as one of the first recorded instances of biological warfare. But in the 14th century, it was viewed as something almost supernatural. The defenders spoke of God's punishment, of the devil's hand, or of the Mongols conjuring a curse. Whether divine wrath or human cruelty, the result was the same. Plague now consumed Kaffa. By 1347, as the siege dragged on, the Genoese realized they could not hold out. Survivors, weakened, frightened, and carrying the unseen seeds of the plague, fled aboard their merchant galleys. They loaded their ships not only with goods, but also with themselves, their families, and their fear. To the sailors, escape by sea seemed like salvation. But the sea would not save them. The galleys left Kaffa and set sail across the Black Sea, through Constantinople, and into the Mediterranean. Some ships carried sailors who were already coughing, already covered in swellings, already dying. Others had men who appeared healthy, but within days fell to the sickness. One by one, crews dwindled. The captains tried to keep course, but when too many men died, the ships were left adrift, their sails slack, their rudders abandoned. And so the plague fleet was born. Ships with no crew drifted aimlessly, pushed only by the wind, carrying their grim cargo of corpses and rats. These were the first ghost ships of the Black Death, vessels of trade turned into floating tombs. From Kaffa's desperate escape would come Europe's ruin. Later chroniclers would trace the spread of the plague along these very routes, from the Black Sea to Constantinople, from there to Sicily, Genoa, and Marseille. The plague did not simply walk into Europe. It sailed in, aboard ships launched from a dying city on the Crimean coast. The people of Messina who stared in horror at the drifting galleys in 1347 could not have known the story of Kaffa. They could not have known that those ships were the last survivors of a cursed siege, carrying with them not just cargo but the consequence of war, desperation, and disease. To them, it looked as though the sea itself had delivered death. But we know now, those ghost ships were born in Kaffa from catapults that hurled disease into the heart of a city, and from desperate merchants who thought escape would mean survival. Instead, their escape doomed half a continent. Chapter 3: The First Ghost Ship Sightings in the Mediterranean. By the late summer of 1347, whispers began to spread across the Mediterranean. Sailors and fishermen reported strange sightings at sea. Merchant galleys drifting aimlessly, sails torn, ropes slack, with no one answering calls from passing ships. From afar, these vessels looked abandoned, yet closer inspection revealed something far more chilling. The earliest confirmed reports came from the Aegean Sea, where Byzantine traders noticed Genoese galleys floating silently with no signs of life aboard. When one bold crew attempted to board a derelict ship near Rhodes, they found the decks littered with corpses. The bodies were blackened with strange swellings, mouths open as if still gasping for air, and rats scurried freely among them. The horrified sailors fled, leaving the galley to drift once more. By October, one of these ships arrived at Messina, Sicily. The townspeople at first thought salvation had come. Fresh goods, news from abroad, and perhaps allies. But when the vessels failed to dock properly, drifting unnaturally into the harbor with sails half raised, suspicion grew. Dock workers who went aboard were met with silence, broken only by the creak of wood and the scratching of claws. Below deck lay the truth. Whole crews dead, their flesh decaying in the stagnant air, their cargo untouched. The Sicilians were horrified. Some claimed the ships were cursed, sent by demons to punish the city. Others whispered that witches had guided them across the waves. But the practical men knew only this. Something deadly clung to those vessels, something invisible and unstoppable. And yet, despite their terror, Messina's harbor authorities allowed the ships to remain. Curiosity and greed outweighed caution, and soon the plague spilled into the city. As the days passed, the strange appearances multiplied. Ships arrived in Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, sometimes with a few survivors still alive, coughing and delirious, sometimes with none at all. Chroniclers wrote of sailors who tied themselves to the tiller, determined to keep the ship on course until their last breath, only to die still clutching the ropes. When their bodies slumped, the vessel drifted on, a coffin borne by the wind. In Venice, one eyewitness described watching from the shore as a galley entered the lagoon without a single man on deck. It struck the dock with a hollow crash, rocking gently as if it were alive. Onlookers hesitated, fearful of boarding. When at last they did, they found men lying as though asleep, yet their sleep was eternal. The rats, bold and unafraid, poured from the ship onto the docks. Within weeks, Venice was ablaze with plague. Stories of these ghost ships spread quickly, not only among sailors but across Europe's inland towns. Monks and monasteries wrote of floating necropolises that delivered death wherever they touched land. Rumors claimed that the ships needed no crew, that they were guided by the hand of God's angel of death, or worse, by the devil himself. Some said the ships were drawn to cities of sin, docking where corruption was greatest. Yet beneath the myth, the reality was already horrifying enough. These were not ships of demons, but of men who fled Kaffa and other ports, only to die at sea, leaving their vessels to wander as carriers of pestilence. Each time they struck a new harbor, they seeded the ground for mass graves. By late 1347, the Mediterranean was alive with terror. Ports closed their gates, refusing entry to foreign ships. Watchtowers lit fires to signal warnings, plagued ships at sea. But trade could not stop completely, and desperation made men reckless. Some merchants bribed officials to let them unload cargo. Others docked in secret, under cover of night. Every such act opened a new doorway for the plague. Thus, the ghost ships were not merely eerie spectacles. They were messengers of death, advancing faster than any army, faster than any caravan. From Sicily, the sickness spread north into Italy, then across the seas to France and Spain. The plague, once confined to the east, now coursed through the veins of Europe, carried not by soldiers or missionaries, but by the silent arrival of drifting tombs. And with each new sighting, the legend grew. To the people of the 14th century, the Mediterranean was no longer a sea of trade and life. It had become a haunted graveyard where ships with no masters sailed freely, bearing a cargo more terrible than any weapon. Chapter 4: Messina's Fall and the Spread into Europe. The city of Messina, perched on the northeastern tip of Sicily, became one of the first true victims of the ghost ships. When the Genoese galleys drifted into its harbor in October of 1347, the people thought little of the sickness at first. To them, it seemed like nothing more than unfortunate sailors who had succumbed to exhaustion or some strange illness from the east. But within days, Messina was transformed. Dock workers who had boarded the ships returned home feverish, their lymph nodes swelling into grotesque, blackened lumps. Families who had touched them fell ill within hours. Priests summoned to perform last rites collapsed before finishing their prayers. What began as a handful of sick men spread like wildfire, and by the end of the month, Messina was choking on death. The city's rulers, desperate to contain the horror, made a drastic decision: banish the ships. The galleys that had drifted into their harbor were pushed back to sea, their ropes cut, left to wander once more. But it was already too late. Rats carrying fleas had already scrambled into the warehouses. Sailors' infected clothing had been traded for food. Coins touched by the sick had passed into healthy hands. Messina was doomed. Within weeks, panic set in. Entire neighborhoods locked themselves indoors. Others fled into the hills, abandoning their homes to rats and ghosts. Chroniclers later described the city as eerily silent, save for the sound of funeral bells, until even the bell ringers died. Corpses lay in the streets, dogs and pigs feeding on them when no one remained to bury the dead. The disease did not stay confined to Messina. Survivors who escaped the city carried it to Catania, Palermo, and Naples. Pilgrims leaving Sicily unknowingly ferried the plague northward to the Italian mainland. Soon, word of Messina's downfall reached the courts of Europe. The tale was always the same. Ghost ships drifting into harbor, men dead at the oars, their vessels floating like coffins. Wherever they landed, the plague followed. In Genoa, fear escalated quickly. When another plague ship arrived, the Genoese panicked and set it aflame at sea rather than risk docking it. The flaming wreck drifted for days, visible from the coast like a burning helmet, before vanishing into the horizon. But even as the people congratulated themselves for avoiding Messina's fate, the sickness had already found its way ashore. Refugees from Sicily had brought it with them. By early 1348, the contagion had crossed into France and Spain, often through the very same mechanism: abandoned ships washing ashore, their crews reduced to skeletons. In Marseille, a merchant fleet carried the sickness inland. In Barcelona, the arrival of a single galley unleashed a wave of death that consumed thousands within months. The plague was not merely killing people, it was dismantling society. In Messina, trade halted, crops rotted in the fields, and thieves prowled freely, knowing few remained strong enough to stop them. Priests who once comforted the sick now fled their parishes. Families abandoned their dead, fearing to touch the bodies. When the Bishop of Messina himself died, it was seen as proof that no one, not even men of God, could escape the wrath carried by the ghost ships. Still, the ships kept coming. Mariners along the coast of Provence reported seeing derelict vessels drifting silently, the waves slapping against their rotting hulls. Some coastal villagers lit bonfires to scare them away, believing the flames might turn the cursed ships back to sea. Others swore they saw shadows moving on the decks, not men, but specters guiding the ships to shore. Whether seen as curses or omens, the truth remained grim. The plague's grip tightened with every drifting vessel. The sea had become Europe's great highway of death, faster than any horse, stronger than any fortress. No wall could keep out a ghost ship, and no prayer could keep its rats from leaping ashore. By the end of 1348, Messina was no longer just a city stricken by disease. It was a warning whispered from port to port. When sailors saw tattered sails on the horizon, they trembled, unsure whether they faced trade or their own destruction. And in the minds of Europe's people, a haunting image took root: a silent ship, moving steadily through the waves, carrying death to every shore it touched. Chapter 5: Venice and the Italian Collapse. If Messina had been the spark, Venice became the roaring inferno. The Republic of Venice in the 14th century was one of Europe's most powerful maritime states. Its fleets dominated the Mediterranean. Its markets brimmed with spices, silks, and silver. The city was rich, crowded, and deeply dependent on ships. But in the winter of 1347 to 1348, Venice's lifeline became its curse. It began when Venetian merchants, unaware of the full danger, docked in the lagoon after trading with Sicily. Their ships carried more than goods: fleas hidden in grain sacks, rats scrambling from barrels, and sailors already coughing up blood. By the time authorities realized what they had let in, the plague was ashore. Venice was a city built on water, and that water became a trap. Unlike Messina, which still had room for people to flee inland, Venetians were boxed into their canals and islands. When the sickness spread, there was nowhere to run. Chroniclers described gondolas ferrying not lovers or merchants, but corpses. The waterways, once symbols of wealth and beauty, became funeral routes. At first, the Venetian Senate tried to control the chaos with law. Officials ordered ships suspected of carrying disease to remain at anchor for 40 days before docking. This measure, quarantigiorni in Italian, gave rise to the word we still use today, quarantine. But even this desperate innovation could not stop the tide. Many ships already in port were infected, and rats moved freely from vessel to vessel. The disease spread faster than any decree could contain. Eyewitnesses recorded horrors that defy belief. Entire monasteries were emptied in weeks, monks lying cold in their cells. Families abandoned their homes, leaving doors swinging open to the sea breeze. Some nobles fled to villas in the countryside, but death followed them along the waterways. What terrified Venetians most were the ghost ships. Dozens of times, fishermen reported vessels drifting through the lagoon, their sails torn, their crews already dead. Some ships collided with piers, spilling bodies onto the docks. Others lodged themselves in the reeds of the lagoon, silent tombs filled with rats. To the Venetian poor, these ships were not just carriers of plague. They were cursed objects, guided by demons or by the souls of the dead themselves. Stories began to circulate of sailors still walking the decks after death. Some swore they saw pale figures moving through the mist at dawn, their faces gaunt, their eyes empty. In taverns, whispers spread that Venice was being punished, not by disease, but by vengeful spirits sailing the Adriatic. Chroniclers later softened these tales, but the fear was real enough to leave its mark. By the summer of 1348, Venice had become a charnel house. It is estimated that 60% of the city's population perished, nearly 100,000 people in a matter of months. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, doors barred, windows broken, their owners long since buried or burned. Even the wealthiest merchant palaces could not escape the rot. The city's famed trade empire nearly collapsed. Ships still sailed, but fewer each month. Captains feared docking in foreign ports, knowing their vessels might be turned away or burned as plague ships. Venetian galleys that had once returned laden with treasure now returned only with silence, or not at all. Some disappeared at sea, their wreckage later found drifting on foreign coasts, carrying skeleton crews reduced to bone and rags. The psychological toll was just as devastating. Venetian diarists describe a city where laughter disappeared, where bells tolled constantly, and where no one trusted a neighbor. Priests moved through the streets with scarves pressed to their mouths, delivering last rites as quickly as possible. Gravediggers collapsed into the pits they dug. Dogs and pigs grew fat feeding on corpses. And still, the ships came. Silent, slow, inevitable. One chronicler wrote, "It was as though the sea itself had become an accomplice to death. No harbor was safe, no island too remote. The ships brought silence, and silence meant the grave." The fall of Venice sent shockwaves through the rest of Europe. If a city as wealthy, as powerful, and as disciplined as Venice could crumble in months, What hope did the others have? Genoa, Florence, Pisa, all would feel the hand of the plague soon after. The ghost ships were relentless, and every port that tried to shut them out found that the sickness always found another way in. By the time the epidemic loosened its grip on Venice, the city was a shadow of itself. Survivors moved like ghosts through empty streets. Gardens grew wild around abandoned churches. The once mighty Venetian navy had been reduced to a flotilla of haunted, half-manned vessels. It was said that for years after, fishermen in the Adriatic still spotted derelict ships drifting in silence, their decks slick with rot, their masts groaning in the wind, reminders that the dead still sailed the seas. Chapter 6: Necroploy, the Dead Fleets. As the plague spread outward from Venice and Sicily, its most haunting legacy followed in the wake of ships. For centuries after, chroniclers across Europe and the Mediterranean spoke of necroploy, a Greek word meaning ships of the dead. It was not a poetic invention, but a term written in actual Byzantine and later Italian records, describing the countless vessels found adrift, abandoned, or crewed only by corpses. The phenomenon was simple, yet terrifying. A ship would set out from port, its sailors seemingly healthy, only for the plague to strike days later at sea. With nowhere to run, the infection tore through every man aboard. Some ships never reached their destinations, drifting until storms dashed them on foreign coasts. Others managed to dock, but by then, their crews were already lifeless. The stories multiplied. A Catalan fisherman wrote of sighting a galley near Majorca, its decks strewn with bodies, sails hanging limp, rats crawling over the dead. In Constantinople, rumors told of ships drifting into the Bosporus with blackened sails, as though even the cloth itself had caught the sickness. Genoese sailors whispered of caravels that sailed past them in silence, no one on deck, yet with lanterns swaying as if unseen hands tended them. Historians now suggest these tales may have been exaggerations, born of fear, but to those living through it, the necroploy were as real as the death tolls in their cities. Entire fleets became cursed in memory. In Naples, mothers warned children not to look at strange ships on the horizon, for they belonged to the dead. In France, rumors claimed that some ghost ships were guided not by wind or current, but by the restless souls of sailors who had refused to lie still in death. One story in particular terrified Europe, the tale of the Caffa fleet. In 1347, after the siege of Caffa, Genoese ships fled the Mongol attack, carrying both survivors and the plague. Some accounts claim not all of these ships made it home. Chroniclers wrote of vessels that vanished at sea, only to reappear months later, found drifting off strange coasts, from Greece to North Africa, with no living soul aboard. To the survivors on land, these sightings confirmed that death itself commanded the seas. Even rulers feared the necroploy. In 1348, King Philip VI of France reportedly ordered coastal guards to burn any derelict ship that washed ashore before its cargo was touched. In England, Parliament records mention measures to block strange and empty vessels from entering harbors, though whether they referred to true ghost ships or just abandoned plague craft remains unclear. But perhaps the most chilling accounts came not from kings, but from ordinary sailors. A Venetian survivor described boarding an empty galley that had drifted near Crete. The deck was covered in dried blood. The galley slaves still chained to their benches were but bones. And yet in the captain's cabin, the logbook was open, the ink fresh, as though his hand had left it only moments before. To the deeply religious world of medieval Europe, such sights could only mean one thing. The ships were not abandoned by accident, but by fate. People believed the necroploy were divine punishment, vessels damned to wander until the end of time. Priests claimed they saw them in visions, sailing across seas of fire. Poets later compared them to the biblical ark, but instead of carrying life, these ships carried only the certainty of death. As the years passed and the plague began to wane, the legend of the ghost fleets did not disappear. Instead, it hardened into folklore. Fishermen along the coasts of Brittany and Spain swore that in certain mists, One could still see black galleys gliding silently, their decks empty, their sails torn. In the Adriatic, sailors told of hearing phantom bells at night, the sound of plague ships calling to shore. Some even claimed that to glimpse a necroploy on the horizon was an omen that pestilence would soon return. Today, historians see these ghost ships as both real and symbolic. Real in that many plague ships truly were found adrift, their crews wiped out by sickness. Symbolic in that they embodied the fear of a world that suddenly realized no harbor, no fortress, no wall could keep death away. The necroploy became a floating metaphor. That plague could travel farther and faster than any army. By the end of the 14th century, the Black Death had killed up to 50 million people, nearly half of Europe's population. And still, when survivors spoke of the years of horror, many did not remember the numbers. They remembered the silence of the sea, the black sails on the horizon, and the ships that came home with no one alive to claim them. In the minds of those who lived through it, the dead never truly left the water. The necroploy sailed on,